And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce David Maraniss, who will give the 2011 Commencement Address. As you have all just heard, Mr. Maraniss is a respected journalist and author who has explored some of the most compelling political and athletic figures of our time. And along the way, incidentally, told us here in Northeast Wisconsin more than a little bit about ourselves. We are honored to have him at St. Norbert College. Please join me in welcoming Mr. David Maraniss.
This is very cool. First, congratulations to the class of 2011. This is a wonderful and unforgettable day for all of you, and it is for me too. I'm honored to be with you today and feel some measure of the same happiness and joy and sense of accomplishment that all of you graduates feel. It just took me 40 more years to get here. I grew up in Madison in a family of scholars. My mother learned Chinese. My little sister was a classical pianist. My older brother and older sister both earned doctorates in Spanish and Russian, while I flailed around in school, not really knowing who I was or what I was doing. My brother Jim and sister Jean are the smartest people I've ever known. And it means the world to me that they're here today, that they came here from Pittsburgh and Amherst to see their little brother finally get a degree. It also means a lot to me that the honor is coming from St. Norbert, this little gem of a school with its commitment to action, social action, and to peace and justice and everything else that the school represents here on the rim of Green Bay. It was almost 15 years ago that I turned to my wife, Linda, and uttered the immortal loving words, "How would you like to move to Green Bay for the winter?" Her first response was "Brr," but she readily agreed to the adventure, and that decision made all the difference. We moved up to a rented cottage in Brussels in southern Door County, not far from Our Lady of the Snows Church, and I began reporting on the life of the great Packers coach, Vince Lombardi. It was one of the best experiences of our lives, and the resonance of that book, When Pride Still Mattered, is why I'm here today in large part, and why I have the freedom as a writer to pursue the books and stories that most interest me. At the time in November 1996, I just finished covering the re-election campaign of President Bill Clinton for the Washington Post. I'd already written a biography of him, and the expectations were that I'd stay in Washington and report on his second term as a so-called Clinton expert. My friends and editors thought I was crazy when I said, "Nope, I'm going to Green Bay." Sometimes when you can, you have to take a chance, do the unexpected, make your own path, follow your instincts rather than what you think other people want you to do. Clinton fascinated me and frustrated me. He had an ability to read a crowd and synthesize information unlike anyone I'd encountered in my long career covering national politics. He had a near photographic memory and could remember everything but some of the lessons of his own life. His story was a cycle of loss and recovery, a combination of darkness and light, the characteristics to some degree of every human being, but exaggerated and played out on a public stage. But he'd exhausted me by 1996, and so had the political culture. 1996, that was a year when most of you graduates were just starting grade school, just starting your conscious lives. You didn't create this political culture, and I have some confidence that you'll somehow figure out how to improve it. But what I was turning away from then was an atmosphere where rationality, humanity, and an open-minded search for truth were becoming overwhelmed by the superficial, the worship of celebrity over worth, and the increasing pervasiveness of know-nothing blowhards who can see the flaws in everyone but themselves. All of those things have become only exponentially more pronounced in the decade and a half since then in this twittering internet world. I'm not saying this as an ode to the good old days. One of the central themes of my Lombardi book is the myth of the innocent past. Human nature doesn't change, only the culture around it. My own profession, writing, journalism, history, has changed profoundly and will continue to change. There well might not be newspapers in the way we know them by the time your children start to read, and maybe not even books as we now know them. I'm sure that more of you get your news from the internet or Comedy Central than from newspapers, and that's not a trend that can't be turned around. Amazon.com now sells more electronic books than paperback books. I happen to grow up in a newspaper age that's as distant to you as the Ice Age, an era of manual typewriters and copy paper and carbon paper and the smell of ink and pneumatic tubes and linotype machines and cigarette butts on the linoleum floor of newsrooms. That's all long gone. Change is inevitable and unstoppable. But the platform, the means by which news and information is delivered, is not really as important as something else. Sifting truth and fact and rational analysis from the overwhelming chaff of unprocessed information and misinformation, the need for the press to do the real reporting must never change, or we will all eventually regret it. So after the election in 1996, I was looking for something different, and that search took my wife Linda and I to Green Bay and Vince Lombardi. Who could be more different from Bill Clinton than Vince Lombardi? New school, old school, one a symbol of discipline, the other its opposite. Actually, these two very different men had more in common than you might expect, including an ability to adapt and an overwhelming obsession to prevail, to win, a characteristic that pushed them forward as it also created imbalances in their lives. Lombardi's known for his obsession with winning. Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. I discovered through tracing it back in my reporting that that famous quotation was not his. It was coined by another coach in the 1930s and first reached the public domain in a movie called Trouble Along the Way, starring John Wayne, and was uttered not by Vince Lombardi, not by John Wayne, but by an 11-year-old actress who was playing his tomboy daughter. To say the least, she did not look or sound like Vince Lombardi. And it wasn't Lombardi's philosophy in any case. He was obsessed with winning, but the effort was what was important to Lombardi. That was everything. He was always much harder on his players when they played sloppily but won than if they gave their all and lost. All the successful politicians that I've studied are as determined to win as Lombardi, each in his own way. I'm now writing a multi-generational biography of President Obama. Obama grew up in Hawaii. Yes, he was born there. A place where being laid back was the defining lifestyle. In the Hawaiian pidgin of his adolescence, they would say, "Cool head, main thing." The uniform of his youth was Ocean Pacific shorts, t-shirts, and flip-flops, known as slippers in Hawaii. But of course, to become president of the United States, you have to have a burning will underneath that cool head. And Obama has it too. With Obama, it was a will to avoid the traps that life set out for him. The trap of not knowing his father, the trap of growing up in Hawaii, a distant island, farther from a continental shore than any place in the world except Easter Island. A place that was such a paradise had become a prison. The trap of being what in Hawaii they call a hapa, half Caucasian, half black, and trying to find his way in two worlds, while society looked at his skin color and classified him only as black. Then he had to figure out how to avoid the trap of racial anger, the trap of Chicago politics and Illinois politics, the trap of living a wholly American life. Like all of you graduates, he was a regular kid, obsessed with basketball and girls and having a good time, and yet being classified by some as alien, foreign, strange, because of his name, because of his skin color, and because of others' fear and ignorance. Trap after trap. And Obama found his way out or around them until he reached the biggest trap and challenge of all, the White House. Vince Lombardi was an outsized figure during my adolescence. He was winning up here in Green Bay while I was a kid down in Madison, free and easy. I know that if he ever saw me during that period, or even today, his first words might be, "Maraniss, get your goddamn haircut." But I felt a strong affinity for him nonetheless. He wore trench coats and smoked cigarettes like my dad. My dad was a newspaperman, a classic city editor type, with sometimes a Lombardi-like gruff exterior. Both Lombardi and my dad came from Brooklyn and made their way to the Midwest where their careers could take flight. I love the fact that Vince Lombardi turned the classic American story on its end. It's usually the small-town kid who goes to the big city of New York to find fame and fortune. And here was Lombardi, New York-born, educated at Fordham University, trained as a head coach in high school in New Jersey, an assistant at West Point and with the New York football Giants, waiting for his chance and not getting it, almost ready to give up, almost ready to take a job as a banker, thinking he would never get his shot, wondering whether it was because his name ended in a vowel. And finally the call comes from the Packers, and he and his family head out to tiny Green Bay, a place he'd only visited once before in his life when he was on a recruiting trip for West Point for the Army team and got caught in a snowstorm here and called back east and said aloud, "I wonder how anybody could live in that godforsaken place." And it was here in Green Bay, not the big city, that in that short decade he became a national icon, winning 5 world championships in 7 years, 7 incandescent years. During our stay when I was researching the book, I spent some time here in De Pere and at St. Norbert. I think the coldest my wife and I have ever been was one January evening when we ran from the parking lot across the street to Biglotti's Pizza Place. Our breath froze on the way over. And one of the most memorable moments in my research is when we went here to interview old Father Burke, one of your great leaders, who I believe was in his late 80s when I got to him. And he told me about all the things that Vince Lombardi had confessed to him in his final year in Green Bay, outside of the church confessional, about how Lombardi was feeling tired and sick and wanted to quit. And then in the middle of our conversation, old Father Burke sprang from his chair with the spryness of a 4-year-old, grabbed his cane, and hit a hard thwack on his windowsill where a squirrel was trying to steal seeds from his bird feeder. He so loved watching those winter bright red cardinals, and he seemed like Vince Lombardi's kind of guy. Vince Lombardi was an imperfect man, striving for the impossible, perfection. Like many great leaders, he took his understanding of the flaws of his own personality and used that to try to perfect the people he led. His mantra was God, family, and the Green Bay Packers. The truth is, he lived his life in a different order. There's a play inspired by my biography of him, and in that, the character of Lombardi's wife, Marie, played by Judith Light, recites that litany, God, family, and the Green Bay Packers. And then she adds, but not necessarily in that order. In fact, his family comes a distant third, and God is not first, so, though to his credit, she adds, he does go to Mass every morning. Downtown, you all know it, St. Willibrod's, 7 a.m. sharp. When he left Green Bay to coach his final fateful year in Washington, a priest in Washington told me about a morning where there was a knock on the door of the Catholic rectory at St. Matthew's Cathedral, and there stood Vince Lombardi, wanting to know when the morning Mass began. 7:30, the priest said, to which Lombardi replied, why don't you change that to 7? That would fit better for my schedule. There was one thing Vince Lombardi couldn't influence. There was still a higher order than a football coach. One of his players, the late Henry Jordan, a Hall of Fame defensive tackle, uttered a line that became famous about Lombardi. Jordan said, he treats us all alike, like dogs. Funny, but not true, really. Lombardi was a master psychologist who knew exactly what button to push in every one of his players. Bart Starr, his quarterback, to whom you gave an honorary degree last year, I can't tell you how happy I am to follow in his footsteps, was a sensitive guy, and after one early encounter where Lombardi yelled at him, Starr said, "If you do that, I can't be the leader of your team." And Vince Lombardi never spoke to him harshly again, ever. Paul Hornung, the Golden Boy halfback, could basically take anything Lombardi threw at him, no big deal, it'd just go off his big shoulders. So the coach used Hornung as an example, knowing it would have no harmful effect. Dave Robinson, his great outside linebacker, one of the black players Lombardi drafted in the first round, during a period when that wasn't done, wondered why Lombardi yelled at him so much, until Robbie's wife went to Marie Lombardi and asked that question, "Why is this?" And Marie said, "It's when he stops yelling at your husband that you should worry," Marie said. "That means he's giving up." Dave Robinson, came to love Lombardi as a father, as did all of his African-American players. They say this is a company town and the company's the Packers. That's a gross exaggeration, I know. Even if it is true that one of the first people we saw here when we arrived that year of 1996 was this loud, gruff man smoking and talking loudly about the Packers at a supper club up in Dykesville while we were eating, trying to mind our own business, and he kept talking. And when he got up, he put on this green and gold Packer jacket. And I asked the maitre d', who was that guy? "Oh, that's a Catholic priest," we were told. I know there are some of you, certainly probably many of you, who really don't have much interest in the Packers, to whom football is not everything, and certainly not the only thing. In his later years, after he became famous, Lombardi gave a lot of advice to people beyond the football field. Business people in particular sought him out looking for the keys to leadership and success. I'm not really big on superficial, inspirational messages. What's important is what moves you, what speaks to you, not what moves or speaks or is important to someone else. Life has common themes, but it's not generic. It's specific. That's what makes it so beautiful in the end, the specific connections of each individual life. Each of your stories, of you graduates, is different. How your family history made it to the point of you reaching St. Norbert, how you got through school here, a course that woke you up and focused you, a book that allowed you to see in a way you'd never seen before, a professor who believed in you, a friend who'll be with you for the rest of your life. The story of every graduate is connected by this jewel of a college, but every one of your biographies is individual and takes meaning on its own, not as some part of some amorphous group. If there's a lesson that I took from Lombardi, and I think might be of some value to some of you graduates in some way, practical and philosophical, it's the notion of freedom through discipline, which I learned by studying the Jesuits. I feel like an honorary Catholic as well. I know that in my own writing, my best moments came, and they come, when I feel free. And I feel most free when I've done the hard work to get there, and have disciplined myself to understand a subject, a theme, a person thoroughly. Lombardi applied this same notion of freedom through discipline to his signature play, what came to be known as the Packer Sweep. Run it again and again and again until the players understand it so thoroughly they can improvise from it, and they have freedom. Freedom through discipline. It's the same with a great jazz musician, with a writer, or a scientist, or a teacher, or a chef, or a painter. It's the same in any profession. You can have a flash of success by posing, by taking an attitude, but that fades, and then what's left? What can you fall back on? If you discipline yourself to learn something first, to master it, then the freedom comes, and the rewards are longer lasting. I've tried to apply this to my own life, imperfectly, but as best I can. Unlike all of you, I was a bad student, but I got a second chance as a newspaper reporter, and that second chance turned into 1,000 more chances to learn. My entire career as a journalist and historian has been learning new subjects, uncovering facts, thinking about the forces that shape lives, visiting new places, and writing about them. It's been a constant graduate school for 40 years. And today, at long last, thanks to St. Norbert College, I stand with you graduates of the class of 2011, proud and happy, ready to commence. I am a Green Knight. Thank you very much.